Hello and welcome to another episode of the Environmental Answers podcast. I'm your host, Tiana Lame. We are here to help you understand environmental issues and matters and increase your environmental intelligence. Today, we are lucky to have George Engelmayr, sorry, I just messed up, founder of Cultivated Biomaterials, here to give us some insight on the product he has created, which is truly innovative. Hey, George, how are you doing today?
Hi, Tiana. No, I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me on today.
So I just wanted to hop in and ask you a little bit about what it is that you're working on now and how that is an environmental answer.
For sure. Yeah. Basically, I'm currently working on cultivated leather. So this goes by a variety of names: lab grown leather, cell based leather. In essence, this is real leather, but grown from cells that are harmlessly isolated from, in my case, an actual sanctuary grazing cow named Angel.
So tell me a little bit more about what it means to be cultivated leather.
Mhm. For sure. And, I'll just show this as an example. So this is actually a cultivated leather credit card holder. And I've actually got some little cards in here to prevent too much bending because it's still a work in progress. Basically, there are all sorts of, and there have been for decades, alternatives to leather. And so, for example, some of the earliest alternatives to leather, vinyl, polyurethanes, they typically refer to them as pleathers. These are one option for folks who want the look and feel of leather without harming animals. More recently, there have been all sorts of other alternative materials implemented. For example, I just saw some recent examples with apple peels and cactus and all sorts of different materials that can be used. What we're doing at Cultivated Biomaterials, and not just myself, but other companies as well, is actually using tissue engineering approaches from the biomedical space, where we grow cells on a material. The cells actually produce tissue on that material, and then that composite material comprising the cells and in my case, a plant-based felt-like material will form the leather or form the skin that we can then put through a tanning process to convert into leather.
So before we dive any deeper, I wanted to get a little bit more information about who you are and how you got to the point of developing such an innovative product. Could you tell us a little bit about your background?
For sure. Yeah. So basically, I got started in chemical engineering way back. Ultimately, went into the biopharma space, like a lot of folks in chemical engineering. And during that time, was introduced to the concept of tissue engineering. And here again, this is where we can take cells, whether it be from a patient or from an animal, in the case of the leather, grow these cells outside the body in a warm atmosphere, at appropriate pH and all these sorts of things, feed nutrients to these cells. And then in some cases in tissue engineering, we're actually using these cells to form an actual tissue. And I mentioned this material that we put the cells onto. We call this seeding the cells onto the scaffold. I've been doing this for 25 plus years at this point. Spent most of my career in the biomedical space, working on heart valves, working on blood vessels, heart muscle, skeletal muscle. And it was actually that skeletal muscle aspect that got me involved in the field of cellular agriculture, where this is kind of the umbrella term for your plant-based meats, including like Impossible, Beyond, all that sort of stuff, as well as cultivated meat, which is where I got started, and then moved over into the cultivated leather space.
That's really interesting. I mean, I've seen like Beyond Meat and a lot of different
Mhm.
trends when it came to like alternatives to meat or traditional things that people have used for consumption prior to. This seems like a pathway to new options for people to see on the shelves. So I was curious about how is this process like developed? Is this something where I know you talked about Angel? Could you tell us a
Mhm.
little bit more about how that works? I know you also talked to me offline about the fact that in the past, the animal doesn't always get to live. But in
Yep.
this case, this is a unique situation. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
For sure. And I'll point to Angel here in the background. So I've actually got a nice print of Angel and myself back in January of this year, 2025. where for the first time in history, a cow was actually able to live to see leather grown from her own cells. And, to folks who are involved in this space and who realize, the importance of this, it's a big deal. Um, Angel was rescued from a ranch several years back, and then brought to a sanctuary called Sweet Farm. Sweet Farm is in the Finger Lakes region of New York. I was actually just visiting with Angel and some of the other animals, and of course the folks who, take care of the animals at Sweet Farm just a couple weeks back. And it's a beautiful location. The animals are taken care of. They have access to all the best medical treatment. They actually end up going over to Cornell's Farm Animal Hospital anytime there's anything wrong. And that's actually where we, back in June of 2023, brought Angel for a routine health checkup. And during that checkup, was able to take a very, very small sample of skin cells that we've since been working with. And, it's just been an amazing opportunity that Sweet Farm made possible for us. This is, as you mentioned, different than what a lot of other folks in the space have done, where the animal is not necessarily, alive, and this is oftentimes out of practicality. Slaughterhouses routinely have tissues that could be made available to companies. And, these are where, in some of the early pilot experiments, people will often get cells. I chose not to go that path, and I'm really, really happy with the outcomes so far.
Oh, that's awesome. So what is some of the interesting opportunities you had to enjoy since starting this company?
Yeah. I mean, first and foremost, it's just been gratifying, not only knowing that Angel is alive and I can go visit her, but even just yesterday, I was at Lehigh University giving a talk to the biomedical engineering department, or the bioengineering department, and was able to put this cultivated leather card holder in the hands of students, in the hands of faculty. I've been kind of on a tour of sorts giving these talks. And, I think when people hold it in their hands and they feel it and they see, this is real, this is real today. It's still expensive. It's still got a ways to go. I'm still using reinforcing materials to strengthen it because, as you can imagine, cowhide, animal hides, leather, these have been around for thousands of years, and these have enabled, humans to flourish, frankly, in terms of, contending against the environment and blizzards and all the sorts of things that folks need to keep warm. And so now that we have the ability to apply biomedical tissue engineering approaches, again, cells with materials, grow that skin and then tan it, again, it's extremely gratifying to be able to be a part of this. There are a lot of other folks that this resonates with, and I don't anticipate this immediately replacing conventional leather, by no means. It's still a very expensive material. It does have a lot of benefits in terms of potential environmental impact, but in order to gain those benefits, this will take years to gain that broader adoption, to scale it up so that we can actually realize those benefits.
An iterative process over
sure.
time, and you're like one piece of the roadmap, I guess, the mapping of
Yep.
this opportunity.
Yep.
Something that came to mind is like the actual product that you have a Kickstarter going for. Could you tell us a little bit
Yeah.
more about that and what's going on there?
For sure. Yeah. And so, as you can imagine, raising capital to do this sort of lab-grown leather, cultivated leather, it's extraordinarily challenging under normal conditions. And more recently, with the pivot of a lot of venture capital going to artificial intelligence, to AI, the entire space of cellular agriculture, again, including plant-based, cell-based, has had some challenges recently. And so I decided, as a solo founder, frankly, as a one-person company, to go a different path and to leverage Kickstarter, one of the crowdfunding platforms, to bring cultivated leather to market, frankly, for the first time, actually. And so the most practical, and I've got different examples of this, what I refer to as angel jewelry. This is actually jewelry in which I've put a cultivated leather inlay
Mm-hmm.
into a bezel, then fitted with a glass cover, a cabochon. And this is a very practical way to get cultivated leather into the hands of folks who, for many years now, have been hearing about this, but you can't buy it. You know,
Right.
it's never been available on the shelf, unlike a lot of the other plant-based alternatives to leather, as well as synthetics. And so the Kickstarter, I launched it on September 9th. It's a 60-day campaign. We're approaching the halfway point.
Yay.
And it's you know, as with anything, it's been a learning experience, learning what storytelling resonates, because it is a complex story. You've got the biomedical component, you've got the animal welfare component, the sustainability components, and all of these merged together. You know, who it resonates with most and how to communicate that has been, you know, fun, frankly.
No, thanks for sharing it. Also, it's really cool to like see the actual jury and also share a little like insight about how to be creative as a solo founder,
Yep.
especially in different climates when it comes to funding and different issues coming up, and you having to be creative and strategic. Another question that came up was understanding how this could, in your mind, in the future, if you were future thinking, be a part of the economy in a more practical sense.
Yes, definitely. And that's definitely the trajectory that I see this going. You know, many of the other, and again, this goes to cultivated meat and cultivated leather, their the mission is very similar in that creating food security in the context of cultivated meat, creating material security in the context of the cultivated leather and any sorts of, you know, materials for that matter, materials that are ultimately going to be fully plant-based, fully sustainable, compostable even eventually. And so, you know, things that aren't going to have chromium in it, you know, and things that aren't going to have these synthetic plastics that are going to take thousands of years to degrade. And so, you know, the key thing about the platform I'm developing is that the materials that I mentioned that the cells grow on, these are very minimally processed, entirely plant-based. Technically, you could eat this, although I wouldn't recommend it necessarily. Even the ingredients that I use to tan this leather, these are more of an artisanal, traditional tanning process using tannins, in my case, from tree barks. I just had a student yesterday ask me about the possibility of using tannins from wine, and for sure, these are all options. In fact, I'm very curious to see what sorts of colors I can get from that. Now, moving forward, as we scale up into the future, again, you know, I get the question oftentimes, you know, how long is this going to take to really make that impact? And everybody is always like 10 years, 10 years, you know.
Mhm.
I tend to go with like the 20 to 50-year range, because coming from that biomedical tissue engineering space, having seen the beginnings of biomedical tissue engineering in the late 70s, early 80s, and then only in recent years have we seen approvals by the FDA of some of these biomedical engineered tissues. For example, in the context of North Carolina, I used to work at a company called Humacyte, where Professor Laura Nicholson founded this company to make tissue engineered blood vessels for
Mm.
dialysis access, for trauma applications. And it took 20 years to get that approved and developed and approved. And so, for sure, this is going to make an impact. It's only a question of when, it's not a question of if. A lot of folks are working on bringing costs down, the cost being one of the key considerations along with scale up. In fact, cost is a significant component of the practicality of scale up down the road. So this is something I'm working on, you know, working with a company called Multis Biotechnology in the UK. They make the nutrients without using any animal products. And
Mm.
so, of course, you know, having no animal products in the process or in the product is, you know, a key, you know, attribute of these cultivated leathers that we need to aim for.
No, it sounds like one, there's a lot of like steps involved,
For
obviously, but
sure. Yep.
also like talking about getting the market ready, right,
Yep.
for
Yep.
this particular product and getting the policies and laws and different things aligned with what it is that you're
Mhm.
developing. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question, because this again comes up in these conversations with students and faculty in the university setting, and I always mention to folks, consumer adoption is ultimately going to be the most critical to actually manifesting these planetary environmental impacts. If potential customers, aren't at some point interested in like really embracing this technology, we could make all the cultivated leather or cultivated meat that we want, and it's just not going to be of any benefit if people don't buy it. That's where I think leather is, far more accessible in that context, because, meat, food, this is, steeped in tradition, different cultures, families. And so if you were not born vegan or vegetarian, or I should say raised in a household that was vegan or vegetarian, it might be really challenging to wrap your head around the notion of meat grown in a bioreactor instead of in an animal. And I think it's going to be through, ongoing education and people really understanding, the how and why that we're doing this. And this is going to take time. Where for leather, especially here in the beginning, whether it be with the jewelry or card holders, next year I'm hoping watch straps and wallets and small purses. It's just a new material, and it has, a lot of really interesting, fashion aspects to it. It has all this technology baked into it. And of course, it has the story of Angel, the first cow to live to see leather grown from her own cells. And so I think we can start there and leverage this as a new material. But ultimately, it's going to be consumer adoption broadly that's going to enable this to have the impacts that we're seeking to have eventually.
I know. I remember I worked for a product company before, and we always talked about the consumer voting with their dollars or supporting with your dollars. Like the speed of whatever is developed is based on interest in actual adoption and use. I think about even as we see the rise of like artificial intelligence, people being able to use all these different platforms increases interest and use. So that makes sense.
Yeah, no, for sure. The cost considerations, even here in the context of this Kickstarter campaign, if I told people how much I spent the past 3 years developing this technology, it's been quite a challenge. And so as I'm initially seeking, to raise thousands of dollars as opposed to millions of dollars to continue the development of this, the price points for the cultivated leather jewelry, where there are no diamonds involved. Some of the bezels are sterling silver. I chose not to pursue gold bezels. It's just, it wasn't immediately clear the market for this. And so, but you do have to price it in a way that matches the actual value of it. And I think, I've been telling folks, this is essentially a biological gemstone at this point. So, if we think about the way that, an oyster, builds a pearl using cells and tissues over time, in essence, this is the same thing, except it's being done harmlessly outside the body of any, and here we can actually go visit Angel in the field. I wish I had the other picture from a couple weeks back where it was sunnier and nicer.
Oh, this is a nice one. I like the phrase biological gemstone, the amount of energy and work that goes into it. And then the metaphor or the example of the pearl, it really makes you think about like how it's being developed, the energy behind it, and how it brings something to market. And you mentioned fashion. You said something earlier offline. We talked about you getting to go to like fashion events. Is that something that you expected out of this work that you were doing?
Early on in the process, and again, I've been at this is the third iteration on the company, Cultivated Biomaterials. So I've been at this for about 3 years now. And over the course of those 3 years, I've had, introductory conversations with various fashion companies, mostly in Europe, a couple here in the United States. And it's challenging there too. And I understand it because, these fashion brands, they are principally brands. They're not there to necessarily develop new materials. And as we think about, all right, implementing any of these brand new materials into an established product line, with all of the the history of these fashion houses, they need to be careful. They don't want this cultivated leather handbag or card holder falling apart in the hands of a customer. So, I've had those conversations. They've been extremely exciting and promising, and it's totally new for me because I'm not a fashion, person by training, or even fashionable, I guess you could say. Now, more recently, I mentioned I went to a vegan fashion festival. I was invited by a fashion influencer, Vicky Lanola, up in Toronto, and she gave me the opportunity to participate on a panel. This was at the VegTO, or Veg Toronto festival. Essentially, it's a vegan festival, and fashion being one component of that. This was on, Sunday, September 21st, it was, up in Toronto. And it was a great opportunity to speak directly to folks. And this also goes to one of the questions that I get asked: is cultivated leather vegan? And there are so many different, arguments or definitions you could wrap around this. I think it would not fit the traditional definition of vegan because it does contain animal cells. Okay. Now, in this particular case, this is all brand new technology. And so when we think about when the term vegan was first coined, and frankly, I don't know when that was, but the basic fundamental ideas behind being vegan and not harming any animals in food products or materials that we work with day to day, tissue engineering, lab-grown leather, none of these things existed when that word was, and when these ideas were first formulated. And so I do think that it resonated with the audience that day. The notion that Angel is here grazing in a pasture at Sweet Farm Sanctuary was never harmed in the process. Taking this small biopsy under expert veterinary care at a farm animal hospital during a routine checkup, this was not something that hurt Angel. You wouldn't be able to find where these biopsies, these small samples, were taken from on Angel. And this was about 1.5 years ago. So now I got lost in my answer.
No, that was a good answer. It was a question about if it was vegan, and understanding that and that thought around that, and really like breaking apart like what the traditional definition of vegan is versus like the concept of just not doing harm towards exactly. Like our fellow animals or creatures with us here on the planet. Mm-hmm. I think another thought that came to mind was centered around the importance of why this is important to start developing now, especially since you said it takes about 20 years, like a time horizon. So like if you could break down why now would be the best time to start.
Yeah, and there's no time like the present, right? They say, and this is also something that in conversations with students, knowing that it is challenging right now, the job market in biotech and cultivated meat and leather, it's really challenging. And so people do want to see, something, promising, optimistic on the horizon. And here again, when we look back to the history of tissue engineering, which is essentially the foundation for making cultivated meat or cultivated leather, a lot of this work, a lot of the fundamentals go way back, but in terms of the concept of tissue engineering per se, actually growing a tissue from cells, this really started with a couple of professors at MIT, Eugene Bell and Robert Langer. And so these were the folks that really set the stage for all of this technology. And this work, again, was done in some cases in the late 70s even, and we can see that how long it took. Actually, some of Professor Eugene Bell, he's since passed, but the legacy that he left with us in terms of putting cells, for example, in a gel of collagen. Now we actually have the ability to make collagen without harming an animal. At that time, the collagen was derived from animals, but and letting these cells contract and form a tissue-like substance that could ultimately be used for burn victims, for diabetic foot ulcers. These products were revolutionary. And of course, Professor Robert Langer, I did my postdoctoral work with Dr. Lisa Freed and Bob Langer at MIT in the mid to late 2000s, I guess it was. It's hard to think back to these times. And so, the technologies that his lab, developed and advanced, these are, finding their way into all sorts of, biomedical tissue engineering applications, including, I mentioned Humacyte in North Carolina. Professor Laura Nicholson trained under Bob Langer, and a lot of that technology was originally developed there. So again, lost track from the beginning.
No, I appreciate it. Something that I want to commend you on is that I've heard that some of the science can get trapped into academic institutions, but
Yep.
you are taking what I would say a calculated risk and investing in a pathway for us to have a better future. So we would like to
Yep.
thank you.
Well,
Is
thank
there
you.
anything else you would want to leave with our audience as we get to wrap up this episode of the Environmental Answers podcast?
Sure. And, this was actually some of the questions that I was getting from some of the students yesterday over lunch at Lehigh University. Were like, do I have any guidance to share if I were to look back on my career, things that I wish I would have known? And I think, and this ties in with the notion of doing this Kickstarter campaign and all of this work and beginning to move it forward now instead of later, is the idea if opportunity doesn't come knocking on your door, you got to build the door and you got to knock on it yourself, and I think creating opportunity now more than ever is extremely important because, again, the job market in biotech and maybe across the board, I'm not as familiar, but not great. And so rather, of course, it's not necessarily in everybody's capability to go and start a company. This was a big risk for my family and for myself to tackle this. And fortunately, I've got an extremely supportive wife, Shadow Huang. She's professor of mechanical engineering at NC State and has been on board on this journey with me all this time. So that's one of the key things I'd like to leave with folks, that whether it be starting your own company or just applying to go back to school or anything that you do in life, not waiting for opportunity, but just creating it out of thin air if you have to.
Thank you. No, that's wise and that's real. I think back to my own experiences. Build the door if you have to.
Exactly, for sure.
Our aim, like always, is to increase environmental intelligence to allow for leaders such as yourself to have the right questions asked so that you can continue forging forward. So again, thank you, George, so much for joining us today. If anyone wants to stay in touch with you or even support the Kickstarter, what's the best place to go?
Sure. I'd say probably the easiest, given that it's always hard to it's hard to spell my last name, is to go on LinkedIn. You can find me on LinkedIn. Please feel free to reach out, send an invite. I use the LinkedIn messaging system. My email address is george@cultivated-biomaterials.com. And so that's also kind of a mouthful, but for sure, please feel free to send me an email there. I'd be happy to speak with folks.
When's the last day of the Kickstarter?
The last day of the Kickstarter is officially November 8th, I believe.
Okay,
And so, still got, I'm actually in the process right now of refining and revamping the materials for the Kickstarter page, and a lot of just the messaging, trying to explain what we're doing, trying to explain the fact that, the angelry, the cultivated leather jewelry grown from angel cells harmlessly, I view it, frankly, as like more symbolic rather than necessarily practical at this point. I mean, I think it looks great. I'm not an expert jewelry maker by any means. All of the jewelry is going to be refined by the time that I actually deliver it to backers of the campaign. But yeah, it's been quite a journey. So.
Congratulations on your journey, and thanks again for joining us.
Thank
We
you.
did want to take a moment and say thank you to our sponsor of this episode, and actually a couple episodes this season is Sonic Cell. So I have this shell I want to show you,
Okay.
in a little mic container. It actually allows me to have my mic inside.
Oh my goodness.
So it's almost like I'm in a mini sound booth. So I'm going to say thank you to Sonic Shell, and also thank you to you, George, for joining on this episode of the Environmental Answers podcast. If you have any questions, know you can always email us at ask@envans.org, and we'll get back to you, or even have the opportunity to answer your question live here on the Environmental Answers podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Till next time. Bye.
Thank you, Tiana. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.